This is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian.
Hey everybody, this is your friendly neighborhood 80s Slasher Librarian. I'm going to be getting into A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream very soon. But first, I wanted to take a second to tell you all about an awesome horror flick that's coming out later. And it is called 13 Fanboy. And it's actually made by Voorhees Films. Deborah Voorhees, you'll remember her from A Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. She got the pretty cool sheer death into the eyes. Anyway, she's making this movie. Here's the trailer for it right now. Check it out.
Who's scared? Who's scared? Scared of what? Well, you know those Friday the 13th movies from the 80s? There's a copycat killer out there killing girls for real. Shut up. Yeah. And they think it's some like crazed fanboy. He's stalking the stars of the original movie.
I wouldn't believe everything you see on the internet.
What was that? Oh yeah, I've heard about this. Just some bullshit for some movie.
Wait, what? Cool. Who's in it?
Tracy Savage.
Ooh, love that blue bikini.
Judy Aronson.
Hottest chick from part 4.
Deborah Voorhees.
Amazing tits.
Dude, shut up. Them and a whole bunch of other actresses from the original movies. And they even had some of the original guys, like CJ Graham.
Wait, no way. The dude that played Jason?
Oh, and Tom Matthews.
That's awesome.
I have proof.
For real?
This was posted live on Facebook. It's the chick that got her eyes gouged out with garden shears. They couldn't find her body anywhere. So it's just a publicity prank. You can't even tell who it is. It's just one of those things where you donate money online.
Yeah, the producers will put your name in the credits, maybe invite you to the premiere, and who knows, maybe you'll even get killed in the movie.
I don't want to be killed in a horror movie. No, thank you.
Well, then just keep your top on, sweetie.
Yeah, you can't die in a horror film unless you show your titties. Come on, guys!
Steve. Stacy!
Stacy! Stacy! Stacy!
I'm leaving. Not that anybody's Jacob. Steve. This isn't funny. Guys?
Looks good. I think that's going to be an awesome movie. I can't wait to see the finished product. Also, guys, check out the description below for a link to Deborah Voorhees' YouTube channel for more information on 13 Fanboy and other works by Deborah Voorhees. And now, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream, Chapter 3. Jacob sat alone on the metal slab of the examining room of the ward at Weston Hills and stared down at the floor. It was green linoleum tile, cracked and weathered at the edges, with little flecks of white in it. Jacob pictured the board of directors out shopping for linoleum, bypassing all the plain green tile, then announcing, "Yes, this is it, the one with the little white flecks," before buying up the entire stock and returning to pave the whole asylum with the stuff. Jacob gave a little giggle at the thought, then quickly sobered up. He'd just killed 4 people. Now was hardly the time to be laughing over linoleum. Or maybe now was the perfect time. He distracted himself from reality for what? All of 5 seconds? That was good. 5 whole seconds without that terrible, sick weight of guilt pressing down on him like a giant rain-sodden mattress. He'd have to do some more of that. Now all he had to do was keep it up for a lifetime and he'd be set. The papers rustled on the desk behind him and Jacob glanced tiredly over his shoulder. There was nobody there, of course. The door to the room was locked, triple barred and guarded by 4 cops. But that didn't mean that he was safe. In fact, far from it. Jacob shivered, his eyes scanning the room with practiced care. It was 30 feet by 45 feet square, he knew, because he'd paced around it with mathematical precision a dozen times in the last hour, and now here he was back on the table again. The room was empty save the desk, the padded table he was sitting on, and the big mirror on the far wall. No chairs, no decorations, nothing sharp or throwable that he could see or use to escape. The only thing in the room that wasn't bolted down was the big pile of papers stacked up on the desk behind him, and that was a fat lot of good as a weapon. He'd glanced through the top few when he'd awoken, just case notes, arrest warrants, the usual kind of thing. He looked under the pile just in case, but there was no pen. Jacob rocked back on the table and looked down at his hands. They were shaking. His entire body was still vibrating from head to toe with the adrenaline rush of shock. There was no window, so he hadn't a clue what time it was. But, judging by the cold ache in his bones, he guessed that it must be approaching 1 or 2 in the morning. So much for a good night's sleep. But that was what Freddy wanted, right? Tire him out, let his control slip just for a minute. Yeah, he'd like that. Jacob ground his teeth together, thinking hard. While he was asleep, he was safe. The pills made sure of that. But during his waking hours, he was pretty much on his own. Nobody knew his secret. He'd never let on, for fear they'd give him more drugs, and maybe the wrong ones, and then Freddy would be free. He shouldn't have mentioned anything to anyone in the first place, but he'd just been so scared. After what seemed like an age, there was a tap at the door. Jacob looked at it for a couple of seconds before realizing that a response was required. "Come in," he said, without much enthusiasm. The door creaked open, and the uniformed guard with a face like a weasel stuck his head around the door. "Got a visitor," he announced flatly. He held the door open and stared at Jacob for a moment, as though his head might fly off on a spring or something. Asshole, thought Jacob sourly. A moment later, the door swung open again, and a tall, imposing man with mutton chops and a velvet waistcoat strode into the room, his shoulder-length black hair flying out behind him. He was tailed by a stern-looking nurse with a clipboard and wild gray hair. Jacob recognized the man immediately and perked up. Jack Kane. Kane was Jacob's caseworker and a frequent visitor to his ward on the 3rd floor. In the 3 years he'd known him, Jacob had come to look forward to Kane's little visits immensely. With a regular and flagrant disregard for the rules, Kane would always bring him an illicit pack of cigarettes or a copy of Hustler. Anything to help Jacob pass the time and make his life a little less shitty. He could smuggle them in past the guards and leave them under Jacob's pillow, so that he'd find them when he went to bed that night. In a strange way, Kane was the closest thing Jacob had ever had to a father. Jacob looked up at Kane, and for the first time in nearly 24 hours he smiled. "Hey," he said. Jacob, my main man! Kane's voice was strong and warm. He stepped into the room and removed his horn-rimmed spectacles, showing no trace of the nervousness the cop had shown. He studied Jacob with great concern. You look like shit, dude. Jacob looked down at himself, at his bloodied, shredded nightgown, and gave a bleak laugh. Would it hold any water if I told you I didn't do it? He asked. None whatsoever, Kane said smoothly. But points for effort. Damn. Jacob took a shaky breath and tried to smile. So I guess that Sunday morning trip to the park is canceled? You could say that. Kane wandered over and sat down on the metal table beside Jacob, to obvious alarm of the nurse. He lowered his voice, all trace of humor leaving his eyes. Want to tell me what happened? Freddy happened, that's what, said Jacob. Ah, yes, Freddy, said the nurse before Kane had a chance to reply. She thumbed through the thick pile of Jacob's case notes, then gave up with the grimace. I've heard that name before. Want to fill me in, Jack? Sure. Kane gave Jacob a brief look of apology, then took the case file from the nurse and settled back on the table, opening the report onto the first page. It's an interesting case. Fred Krueger. Have you heard of him? I've heard something. The nurse looked distinctly uncomfortable. Wasn't he the guy who killed all those kids? That's right. Krueger murdered nearly 30 children some years back. Kane's eyes darkened. The children he killed were all little ones, 6 or 7 years of age, mostly, and they all lived in Springwood. He had a thing for little girls. He was a real nasty piece of work. Everyone knew someone who had lost a kid, a friend, a neighbor, a relative. The town was ripped apart by this guy. That's terrible. Did they catch him in the end? Jacob shifted uneasily on the bench, looking up at Kane with a question in his eyes. Kane ignored him and carried on. In a way, yes. Kid number 30 goes missing. And finally, this cop gets a tip-off and goes to his house. Finds all this sick shit. Photos of the dead kids, toys, bits of hair. He kept them as trophies, you see. The cop knows there's another kid missing, so he goes screaming up to the big power plant where the guy works, and literally catches him red-handed. He just killed this little girl, and he was going to use the plant's furnace to dispose of the body. Just like he did with the rest of the kids, you see. He really thought that he could get away with it. Kane shrugged and flicked through Jacob's file. So finally, this dirtbag gets hauled in and dragged to court. But after all of that, he escapes on a technicality. The cop didn't have a search warrant when he busted him, and so this slime bag gets off scot-free. The nurse shook her head wonderingly. But surely, if they found all that stuff at his house... Kane shook his head. It was all inadmissible as evidence. The judge's hands were simply tied. Kane sat forward on the bench, excitement lighting up his eyes. But that's not the end of it. Later that night, a big bunch of local folk get together outside the courthouse. Parents, teachers, neighbors, friends of friends. They're out for blood, and who can blame them? Krueger killed their children, then laughed in their faces. Kane took a deep breath, avoiding Jacob's gaze. They basically hunted this guy down and trapped him in his own boiler room, then set light to the place and stood around and watched him burn. Boom! Psycho goes up in smoke. The world is healed. The end. Kane closed the file and tossed it down on the bench next to Jacob. And they didn't get arrested for that? Asked the nurse, looking uncomfortable. Kane shook his head. There were cops amongst that lynch mob. Even the sheriff was there, or so I heard. It was all very hush-hush, you see. Kane glanced quickly up at the nurse. You signed the confidentiality agreement when you joined us, right? Right. Good job, or we'd have to kill you. No, sorry, bad taste joke, he said as the nurse took a step backward. Kane spread his hands wide and gave a hasty little laugh. It's all in the past. Nobody wants to remember that stuff. It's over now. Except that it isn't, is it? Said Jacob, gazing at the floor. The nurse looked at him. Jacob regarded her coldly through red-rimmed eyes for a second before jerking his head at Kane. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her what?" Kane's smile seemed to freeze. "The rest of it. About the other kids, about my folks, about me." "Oh, I don't think she needs to know about that," Kane said. He flicked through Jacob's file again, then turned and beckoned the nurse over to the other side of the room. Jacob wanted to know what they were doing. He watched them suspiciously from the table. "He's basically delusional," whispered Kane. "His father died in the car accident before he was born, and he thinks that Kruger came back from the dead and killed him." He shook his head, watching Jacob closely. This triggered a drive for revenge against Kruger's ghost, which caused him to harm himself during various self-directed revenge attempts, which usually take place at night, you see. He believes he has special powers to control people's dreams, delusions brought on by ideas implanted in early childhood by his mother, who was, well, we all know about his mother. Kane leaned over to the nurse and pointed to a page in Jacob's file. The nurse exclaimed, "Oh!" and looked at Jacob with fresh interest, who glowered up at her before shooting Kane an affronted look. "So why was he sharing a dorm room?" A muscle in Kane's jaw twitched. "He's made great progress over the last few years. We thought he was cured." Kane shrugged helplessly. "Looks like the ghost is back." "Freddy's not a ghost!" shouted Jacob from the other side of the room. Kane cursed under his breath. The kid had good hearing. "Jacob, we've been over this, pal," he said loudly. "Fred Kruger is dead. He died years before your father had his accident. He couldn't possibly have killed him." "Says you." Kane closed Jacob's case file with a snap that made both Jacob and the nurse jump. "Ethel, could you be a sweetheart and go get me a blanket? I think there's some left in the store cupboard on the second floor. You must be cold, right, Jacob?" he asked, nodding his head fractionally, but he did not smile. "Freezing my balls off, thanks for asking," replied Jacob pleasantly. "Indeed. Sitting there in that gown. We can't let you change till forensics get here, but we can at least wrap you up a bit." "Forensics?" said Jacob. A wave of gray tiredness washed over him. He pushed his dark hair back off his face, leaving a faint smudge of dried blood on his forehead, and rubbed his hands together miserably, glancing around the room. Little flakes of dried blood floated downward, rubbed off his palms. "So I can't have a shower?" Kane shook his head. "Sorry, kid." Jacob rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand and tiredly turned to the nurse as she started toward the door. "Could you get me a double half-cap all-foam latte with skimmed dog milk while you're down there?" "Excuse me?" "Get him a coffee from the machine," Kane translated. "I like it extra lumpy," added Jacob helpfully, picking the dried blood from his fingernails. The nurse gave him a strange look and walked to the door, leaving with a considerable amount of haste. When they were alone, Jacob stood up and wandered over to the mirror, his back to Kane. "You think I'm a wacko, don't you?" he said, gazing at his own haggard, blood-stained reflection. "Well, yeah," said Kane. "This is a nut house after all. If you were sane, then I'd be inclined to be worried about you by now." "You and me both," said Jacob distantly. He reached out a finger and touched the mirror. It left a rust-red mark. He stared at it for a moment, then put another beside it, and one below, then drew a smiley mouth at the bottom, making a face. Jacob stared at the face in a sleep-deprived fog. He was really losing it. Then he jumped as the mouth moved. It squirmed across the glass as though it were alive. It shimmered lightly, then twisted upwards into a malevolent grin. "Hi, Jacob," said the face. On the other side of the two-way glass, Police Officer Tom Dewey watched Jacob as he stared fixedly at his own reflection in the mirror, a freaked-out look in his eyes. "There's something seriously wrong with that kid," he said. "You're telling me," replied Officer Lopez. She clicked off her CB radio and reached for her styrofoam cup of coffee. She took a sip and grimaced. Geez, what is that shit? Are you trying to poison me? It's all they had. Take it or leave it. Officer Lopez took another experimental sip. It's like drinking the contents of a colostomy bag. No wonder the poor kid went postal, drinking this shit every day. What do you think they'll do with him? The kid? Officer Lopez shrugged. Solitary for a couple days while they run some tests. Then they'll bang him up for X number of years, till he's dead or sorry, possibly both. You don't think they'll plead insanity? Nah, you read his case file. Twice. Me too. A pause. Does he know? Officer Dewey jerked a thumb through the observation window, where Kane was chatting to Jacob. The two officers shared a look, then, as one, put down their drinks and headed for the door. Jacob stared at the face in the glass, forcing himself to remain expressionless. He was being watched from both sides, and to start a conversation with the talking mirror in a loony bin would not help his case. Jacob! Croaked the face again, then broke into a throaty chuckle. The eyes on the glass blinked, then started to enlarge, the dried blood around their edges liquefying. The pupils snapped into focus on Jacob, reflecting his own image back at him in 1,000 shimmering shades of red. Slowly the face started to become a three-dimensional thing, pushing itself out of the mirror with a sound like a finger squeaking across a wet glass. Fuck off, Jacob thought desperately. The face laughed nastily. What was that? You'll have to speak up a bit, or draw me some goddamn ears. Leave me alone, yelled Jacob across the room. Kane glanced over at him, a worried look in his eyes. The face merely smirked, then pushed itself further out of the mirror, with the wet sucking sound. It was solid, and Jacob was repulsed to see that there were maggots crawling around in the blood that it was formed from, writhing and crawling over one another, and then flattening out to form the blood-coated skin of the face. The eyes creased into a smile as they looked in Jacob's disheveled appearance. Nice job back there, by the way. A gauntleted hand punched through the mirror, and mimed stabbing motions, blood dripping onto the floor. Couldn't have done it better myself. Shut up, whispered Jacob. No, seriously. That bit where you stabbed that screaming little bitch right in the gut, that was priceless. I said shut up. Jacob? Kane hurried across the room to join him. What is it? Nothing, growled Jacob. He glared at the leering face, knowing that Kane wouldn't be able to see it. Everything's just hunky-dory. You know what? Growled the face. You really want to be just like me. You should get a hat. I don't want a hat, said Jacob levelly. Kane reached out to put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. You know what? Maybe you should come and sit down again. I don't want to sit down. Jacob whirled and glared at Kane. A vein in his neck started to throb. All right, that's cool. Kane held up his hands, backing off. Listen, I'm just going next door for a... Jacob gave a yell as a blood-stained hat suddenly materialized on his head. For an instant, he felt maggots crawling around under it, trying to burrow into his scalp, and he swept it off onto the floor with a cry of disgust. He began stamping on it, frantically running his hands through his hair, as though he were being attacked by a swarm of wild bees. Jacob? Kane watched him in concern. The kid was having some kind of a fit. He hesitated, then reached into his briefcase for a sedative. What is it? He asked. Is it Freddy again? Don't patronize me, snapped Jacob. I know you don't believe that shit. In the mirror, Freddy winked at him, then slowly started to slide his finger knives through the glass, one at a time, out into the real world. Scream! Razor-sharp metal scraped across cut glass, and every muscle in Jacob's body tensed. He watched the points of Freddy's knives emerge from the mirror, the reflective surface sticking to them like shiny glue. A voice hissed in his ear, a sibilant whisper that seemed to bypass Jacob's brain and go straight to his spinal column. I need your help, Jacob. The kids have forgotten me. I need you to make them remember me. I can't come back if they don't remember me. Jacob said nothing, staring fixedly at the wall. You know what you could do if you tried? You could be just like me. Shut up, said Jacob desperately, deepening his voice. He put his hands over his ears and grabbed handfuls of his hair. I'll never be like you. I'll die first. Okay, fine. Kane paused a moment and put his meds back in the bag. He was going to need something stronger. I'm just worried about you, Jacob. You've been through a lot tonight. A second knife emerged from the glass, bit by bit, making another scree noise. Jacob's fist clenched as he stared at the emerging knife. I'd be worried too. He gave a humorless smile, feeling madness dance a little jig in his brain, then will to confront Kane. And quit being nice to me, Jack. I just butchered my bunkmates. Why the hell are you being so goddamn nice to me, huh? I just want you to calm down. That's all. I am calm. In the mirror, Freddy smirked. You know your daddy cried before I killed him. Ha 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 ha. Jacob whirled and grabbed Kane's briefcase and hurled it with all his might through the two-way mirror. Don't move! Two cops burst into the room, aiming their pistols right at him. Before Kane could move, they ran over to Jacob and grabbed him, wrestling him to the floor. Jacob did not fight them. The door flew open behind them, and Dr. Timmerman, head of the faculty, came in. He gave Kane an accusing look, then strode rapidly forward, pulling a syringe out of his pocket. Kane stood in his way. What are you doing? He's not trying to get away. Stand aside, Jack. Timmerman crunched his way across the broken glass on the carpet to Jacob. He reached for his arm, needle at the ready, and was rewarded with a hefty back swipe to the face. Jacob was young, but he made the most of the daily workouts the faculty offered. The psychiatrist clutched at his face as blood spurted from his nose. Hold him down, damn it! He shouted. Sorry, sir. Officer Lopez had the decency to look abashed. For Christ's sake, look at this mess! Dr. Timmerman grabbed Jacob's flailing arm and plunged his needle into the muscle of his bicep. He withdrew the needle and sniffed. No wonder this place is falling apart. Kane stepped forward. I was only trying to. Timmerman rounded on him angrily. I don't care what you were trying to do. Jack, rules are rules. I told you to wait for me before debriefing the patient. We've already lost one kid this month. Why in the name of blue blazes can't you follow procedure for once in your life? I'm sorry, I just thought that. Oh, you thought, did you? Those were children he killed, Jack, under my roof. What do you want me to tell their parents? I had no way of knowing, Bill. He seemed better. I made the decision. Kane paused and played his trump card. Just like you did with his mother. Dr. Timmerman stared hard at Kane. His jaw clenched as he wrestled with himself. Then he sighed and turned away. Reaching down, he hauled Jacob to his feet. The boy reeled, already in the grip of the sedative. Hold him for me, he said gruffly. Kane nodded briefly to himself. Point made. He grabbed Jacob around the shoulders, supporting him. Jacob slumped forward, then caught himself and put a hand on Kane's arm to steady himself. You should get away from me, Jacob whispered, his eyes unfocused. I've caused you enough trouble already. Why do you keep sticking up for me? Kane glanced through the glass, then turned his body away from the mirror and leaned in close to Jacob. Because I believe you, he whispered. Jacob stared at him. Are you crazy? Quite possibly, said Kane. He glanced up at Timmerman, who was now venting his wrath by shouting at the cops, who stood by the shattered mirror, looking for all the world like two small children being scolded by their schoolteacher. Kane leaned in closer to Jacob. Look, I've done some research into the Kruger guy, and, well, I think we should talk. He eyed the cops and dropped his voice still lower. I want to help you. I need to make sense of this as much as you do. If there's some kind of cover-up, a conspiracy, whatever, I want to know what the real deal is. Jacob stared at Kane, struggling to focus. You really believe me? Absolutely. Kane stood up. You have my word. We'll talk. In the meantime, he gestured at Dr. Timmerman. I have to go make nice with the chief. You want me to stay on your case, right? Right. Then wait here. Kane winked at Jacob, then strolled over to Timmerman, picking his way across the broken glass on the floor. Kid's lost it, he said quietly. I'll dose him up. Timmerman shrugged. Tell me something I don't know. He pulled a big bottle of blue pills out of his bag and glanced over his shoulder at Jacob. He's got his Hypnosil last night, I trust. Right. Good. Timmerman rattled the bottle before handing it to Kane. I'd double the dosage. We can't be too careful with these cops sniffing around. The guys upstairs can make the big lawsuits go away. But the last thing I want is some two-bit sheriff snooping around asking questions, getting everyone all worked up. He gave Jacob a haunted look. Know what I'm saying? Absolutely. I'm right behind you. Kane cracked open the cap on the bottle of Hypnosil and made a big show of pouring several out into his hand. Then he strode over to Jacob, whistling. As he reached him, he slipped the Hypnosil into his side pocket, then opened his other hand to reveal two identical blue vitamin pills. Kane smiled to himself, then put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Hey, kid, he said lightly. Time for your meds. Chapter 4. Jen took a deep drag on her cigarette, then blew a thick steam of smoke out the window as she pulled out of the school parking lot. So you're telling me that if Mr. Davies ever came on to you, you wouldn't leap at the chance to fuck him? No, I don't know. He's like, what, 30? Ella gave a shudder. That's way too old, even if he is cute. With the most amazing hair in the world. She trailed off, biting her bottom lip. Okay, maybe. But he'd have to be rich, too, and buy me lots of pretty shiny things. And have a wife who's away on business a lot. Honey, there is no such thing as too old. Jen shot Ella a knowing look. You see those thighs when he was teaching track the other day in those tight little shorts? Every time I close my eyes, said Ella. She gave a low whistle and shook her head ruefully. The man is built like a Greek god. I swear, if there hadn't been that chain-link fence between him and me, they'd be scraping me off his leg like a dog in heat. You and me both, babe. We'd, have to take a leg each. Jen handed Ella the remains of her cigarette, then scratched her nose, thinking, Hey, you think he works out naked at home? Don't. Ella giggled helplessly and reached around to bat at Jen with one hand. She groaned, slapping her forehead with the other. Okay. Now he's all naked in my head. I'm going to need some serious drugs to get me to sleep tonight. Told you. Jen nodded sagely, then sighed and settled back in her seat. She waved an arm in frustration. And here we are, stuck with a bunch of immature 18-year-old losers. I tell you, girlfriend, you get the choice, pick the older ones. You'll have much more fun. In the driver's seat, Matt's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Then he reached forward and abruptly switched the radio on. The frenetic sounds of thrash metal filled the car. Jen rolled her eyes as if to say, See what I mean? Ella winked at Jen, flicked her cigarette out of the window, then gazed happily out of the car as it picked up speed, cruising toward the highway, music blaring loud. She normally hitched a lift home with Jen, but tonight it was Matt who was driving. After Jen's little fender bender last week had put her silver Mazda in the shop for a couple weeks, at a cost that had even given her father pause. Matt had a 1969 Ford convertible with a cherry red paint job, and Ella had jumped at the chance to ride home with him. She loved riding in convertibles, top down, wind in her hair, trees streaking past overhead. So far removed from her parents' boring hatchback sedan with the annoying back windows that didn't wind down, even in the 80-degree heat. Though it meant having to spend an extra half hour in Matt's presence, it was worth it. It wasn't that she didn't trust him exactly. It was just that they didn't have much in common. Besides which, Ella was sure that Matt's offer to drive them both home tonight had nothing to do with him overhearing her talking about the party. She smiled to herself. Yeah, right. Ella glanced at Matt as he changed gear, urging the little car up the steep hill toward the main road. He drove in silence, occasionally reaching down to change the radio station whenever something came on that was under 160 beats per minute. He'd said very little since they'd set out, contenting himself with the occasional furtive glance at Jen. Ella wondered whether Jen was even noticed. "So, is Little Miss Goth coming to the party tomorrow night?" Jen asked. "Oh God, here we go," Ella thought. "You got a problem with that?" "No, it's just that Jen saw the expression on Ella's face and fell silent. Then she shrugged. "Okay, fine. She can come, but only if you look after her." "No probs." Ella glanced out the window, a little annoyed at Jen's attitude. Nikki had been through a tough time recently. What with her parents' divorce and all. Apparently both her folks were nut jobs. Rumor was rife that her mother had recently been arrested after overdosing on heroin, which she'd heard had started the whole thing off. Nikki had previously confided to Ella that her parents took out their anger at their crappy lives on her. Every day she seemed to have a new bruise, a different bandage on her arm. It made Ella mad as hell, though she'd practically have to pry out of Nikki what had happened. She used to make up some crappy excuse about walking into the garage door or some other shit, but since leveling with her, she would make it very clear when her parents were involved. Her father was the worst, as she described it, coming home at all hours of the night in a foul temper, waking everybody up with his yelling. He regularly trashed the house, and as an only child, Nikki had nobody to defend her from him. Time and again, Ella had threatened to call the cops on him, but Nikki would beg her not to. It would just make things worse, she'd say. Reluctantly, Ella had agreed not to interfere. She kept an eye on her, though, just in case. If Jen didn't share her concern, that was her problem. Jen suddenly sat upright in the seat. Turn here!" Matt rolled his eyes. "I know where you live, Princess. I've dropped you off like a dozen times." "No, I want to go to the shoe store. I need some new heels for the party tonight. Be a sweetie and drop me off, would you? I'll call Dimitri for a ride home when I'm done." "Whatever." Matt turned the car into the parking lot of the outlet mall and slammed it into neutral, using what Ella thought was an unnecessary amount of force. Jen pulled her red purse out from under the seat, then looked at Matt expectantly. "What is this, like the Springwood Marathon? It's a mile across that lot to the store." "I'm not your chauffeur. You've got legs. Use 'em." "Fine." The door slammed, and then Jen was gone. Ella glanced at Matt, who avoided her gaze and threw the car into reverse, speeding backward out of the lot. He turned back onto the main road, accelerating off in a spray of gravel. They drove in an uncomfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Ella said, "She doesn't mean to be rude, you know." Matt just shrugged, concentrating on the road. Then he reached down and clicked the radio to a different station, hunting for new tunes. "So," he said casually, "big party tomorrow night, huh?" Ella tried not to smile. "So I hear. Jen's organizing it." She reached into her bag for her cell phone, watching Matt out of the corner of her eye. He ran through the radio stations without really listening to what was playing, occasionally glancing up at her. After several long moments had passed, she decided to prod him a little. "Aren't you going to ask me where it is and what time it starts?" Matt opened his mouth to reply, then thought better of it. He shrugged, trying to act casual. "Not really. I was just making conversation." "Fine, if you don't want to go." Ella saw Matt's hands tighten on the wheel. She knew she could be a little bitch sometimes, but this was for his own good. If he was going to make any headway with Jen, he was going to have to learn to be more proactive. She watched as he licked his lips and glanced up at her warily. "So, does she ever mention me?" he said at length. "I mean, at all?" Ella glanced at Matt in surprise. That was brave, at least for him. She tried to answer without mortally offending him. "She's mentioned you," she said. "Well, it was kind of the truth." "She has?" Matt sounded so eager that Ella mentally kicked herself. "Yeah, on a couple of occasions." In her head, Ella distinctly heard Jen's voice, complaining at great length about Matt following her around like a puppy dog. Poor kid. Matt opened his mouth to speak, then paused, staring out of the windshield. "What is it?" asked Ella. "That." Matt pointed to the road ahead of them. 2 long black tire marks streaked across the asphalt in a zigzag line. "Ouch!" Ella looked further up, where the tracks left the road. The dark shape of a burnt-out SUV was visible in the field next to the road, surrounded by a maze of torn-up bushes and vegetation. Matt slowed the car as they approached the wreck, peering through the side window. "Don't stare." "Why not? There's nobody there." A strange glint came into Matt's eyes. "Want to go check it out?" Ella glanced at her watch. "Come on, it'll only take a minute. Besides, I could use some more scrap metal." "You're working on a new sculpture?" Ella asked. Matt actually laughed as though he was surprised she even knew that much about him. "Well, something like that." Ella clambered out of the convertible and stood with her hands on her hips, gazing down at the wreck in the rays of the setting sun. Matt stepped up beside her, his eyes glittering. "Awesome." Ella thumped on the arm. "Don't say that. Somebody could have died in there." "What do you think? There might be bodies in there?" "Ew, no." Ella pulled a face. "Pity. Let's go check it out anyway." "You know, I really should be heading home, Matt." But Matt hopped eagerly over the wide drainage ditch that separated the field from the road and made his way down the grassy bank toward the wreck. Ella sighed, glancing at her watch and mentally cursing Jen, then followed him at a slightly slower pace, gingerly picking her way over lumps of mud and brambles. The hulk of the SUV stood alone in the midst of a circle of burned grass and vegetation. Its front windshield was smashed, and all the paintwork on its left-hand side was charred and blackened. There was a string of striped yellow police tape wrapped around it. "Hey, come look at this." "What?" Ella walked over to Matt, who was crouching by a nearby tree. He pointed at its trunk in a stare of great excitement. "There's blood here." "Oh, great. Do you want to go look inside the car for severed body parts, too?" Ella saw the flash of interest in Matt's eyes, and immediately regretted opening her mouth. "You cannot be serious, Matt." "Come on. Where's your sense of adventure, Ella?" "I had it surgically removed at birth. Now let's go." "No way. This is too cool. I want to check it out." Ella shook her head in wonder. She hadn't seen Matt this animated since they found a dead deer in the road last Christmas. There was something very odd about the guy, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She took a step toward the SUV, studying it cautiously. One side of the car had been completely burned away, the underlying steel chassis exposed like a metallic skeleton. The wind rustled through the long grass, and Ella almost fancied she could see the flames pouring off the car like ghostly ethereal fire. She blinked and rubbed her eyes. She was seriously in need of some sleep. A bird trilled in alarm as they approached the car. Matt rubbed his bare arms thoughtfully, glancing around him in distaste. "I hate nature," he said with considerable feeling. "I always feel like it's out to get me." Beckoning to Ella, he ducked under the police tape and examined the SUV. "Look here!" Matt pointed at the smashed windshield, which had a roughly circular hole on the driver's side, about 1.5 feet across. Dude was not wearing his seatbelt. He glanced back at the tree excitedly. He was probably all like, "Shit, my car's on fire!" Then he freaked out and went off the road, hit that sign back there, and went flying out through the windshield, blammo, right into that tree. "Way to go, Mulder. Case closed. Listen, we should go. This place is creeping me out." "Oh, quit being such a girl. You women folk are too damn fragile." Matt tugged on the door handle experimentally. "Whoa, look, it's open." Ella stepped back in distaste as Matt yanked the back door open and stuck his head into the SUV. Started rooting around inside the car as well. A moment later, he gave a triumphant cry and hopped back down again, waving a package at her. "Bingo!" Ella looked worried. "Hey, maybe you shouldn't take that. What if it's evidence?" "If it was evidence, then someone would have taken it after the crash," said Matt. He dropped down into a cross-legged position on the grass and began eagerly turning the charred box over in his hands, searching for an opening. Ella watched as he pulled a silver switchblade out of his boot and deftly sliced through the silver duct tape that sealed the box. Inside were a bunch of papers. Ella crouched down by Matt and glanced over his shoulder as he emptied the box out onto the grass. He picked up the top sheet and studied it doubtfully. You know, I was kind of hoping there'd be money in here, or at least some decent porn. Here, let me see. Ella grabbed a handful of the papers and held them up to the dying afternoon sunlight. She flicked through the thick pile, fanning them out in her hands. No porn here. Looks like copies of someone's medical records. Well, that blows. What did you expect, the secrets of the ancients? Matt shrugged and clicked his knife shut and returned it to its hidey hole. He drifted back across to the wreck, eyeing it appraisingly. For want of anything better to do, Ella sat back on the long grass and began reading the records as sounds of scraping and clattering came from over her shoulder. After a while, she paused, frowning. Matt? Uh-huh. Matt paused in his attempt to remove the front hubcap from the car with his penknife and peered over at Ella. What is it? Come take a look at this. Ella handed the records to Matt and watched as he read, occasionally moving his mouth at the more difficult words. Finally, he asked, Is this for real? You're the one who found them, you tell me. Matt slowly shook his head. This is some freaky shit. And look at this. He held out the bottom paper, which was quite clearly stamped with an official-looking logo. Secret government stuff. Matt's eyes were shining. And we found it. I don't know. We should put it back. What if it gets us into trouble? Ella swore she had never seen Matt this excited in her life. Who the hell cares? Matt was engrossed. He leaned in closer to Ella as he read, putting a hand on her shoulder to steady himself. That's just crazy. What is this guy, some kind of mutant freak? Look at all this stuff. Ella scratched her head. That's got to be fake. I don't see how he could do that. And look here. He thrust a grubby finger at the paper and gave a long, low whistle. All these test results? I don't believe it. This has got to be a setup. Ella peered at the bottom of the report. Who's Freddy Krueger? She paused, squinting at the paper. And why is he classified? Behind her, the long grass rippled in a sudden breeze that sprang up from nowhere. Ella shivered. It says... She paused, her lips moving soundlessly. Oh, no, that can't be right. I don't believe that. Told you, said Matt matter-of-factly. He flicked the report with a finger. Conspiracy. Wait till Jen sees this stuff. Matt, I don't know about this. If it's real and we show it to people, we could get into trouble. Sounds like fun to me. Matt's face was alight with excitement. Ella had never seen him more animated. He glanced around him at the trees, making sure nobody else was around. Hey, he said, lowering his voice. You want to go for a drink? We could, talk about this, figure out what to do. I bet there's some secret government agency that would just kill to get their paws on this stuff. I don't know. Maybe some other day. It's late, said Ella unhappily. Well, that sucks. A look of anger flashed across Matt's face. What have you got to do that's more important than this? I should really be getting home. My folks are expecting me. Really? Really? To do what? Dinner, TV, parenting stuff. Matt stared at Ella as the wind rustled in the grass. It's me, right? It's me, isn't it? What is? Ella turned away and gathered up the papers. He was looking at her in a way that she didn't much like. I don't know what you're talking about. She reached for the box, then found Matt's hands on hers, gripping her wrists lightly. She turned and looked into his eyes, that were the color of the sea before a storm. Yes, you do. Matt's voice was low and cold. He shifted his grip, his fingers lightly brushing the soft skin on the underside of her wrist. You're a reporter. If I was anyone else, you'd be all over this. You just don't want to spend any more time with me than you absolutely have to, do you? He glanced at his watch. Hell, you've been with me for over half an hour now. You must be just itching to get away, right? That's not true. Bullshit. I know what you guys say about me behind my back. Ella swung around and stared at Matt. Meaning? You just think I'm after Jennifer. None of you really give a shit about me. You don't even want me at your stupid party. But that's all right. I couldn't expect you to understand. Look, Matt. No, you look. He tightened his grip. I don't know what you two talk about, but whatever you think about me, it's not true. She never said anything, and quit pawing me. Ella wrenched her wrist from Matt's grip and stood up quickly. He jumped up as she turned away. Right. So, what are all those silly little looks about? What little looks? Matt, you're being paranoid. And for a reason, yeah. You're all the same, always whining and bitching behind people's backs. You don't care about anybody or anything but yourselves. It's a wonder you two little sluts haven't been taken down a peg or two by now, 'cause God knows somebody oughta. Excuse me? Ella couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Was this really the same guy she'd been talking to minutes ago? You heard me. Matt's face twisted into a sneer. Bitch! Matt, what's wrong with you? Ella took a quick step back as Matt came stalking toward her. Hey, back off! Ella stared hard at Matt, her eyes flashing, then deliberately turned her back on him and started marching back across the grass to the car. That's it. I'm out of here. Deal with your issues and call me when you're done. You think I'd have issues if it wasn't for you girls? Matt ran after Ella, grabbing her arm. Ella whirled and reflexively struck out at him with her free hand, catching him a glancing blow across the side of the head. Get off of me, freak! Matt's eyes seemed to change from gray-blue to black in a split second. He shoved Ella backward without seeming to draw breath, sending her reeling into the blood-splattered tree. Then he pulled his knife out of his boot and stepped toward her. "5 miles away, Dr. Sally Spencer sat in her booth at the busy drive-through restaurant and stared listlessly down at the burger in her hand. It was a lettuce burger, no carbs, no fat, just a plain veggie burger wrapped in lettuce leaves, following the latest fashion for not eating bread, dairy products, or anything that might possess any taste whatsoever. She had ordered it in a state of numb listlessness, realizing that her body needed food, vaguely wondering what a lettuce burger actually was. Well, now she knew. More specifically, she knew never to order this shit again. Above the counter, the clock ticked up to 6 p.m. Piped Elvis crackled from the radio by the cash register, and the smell of burning meat wafted through from the kitchen. Sally screwed up her nose with a shudder at the memories the smell awakened. Then she studied her burger warily from several angles, as though it might leap up and attack her, lifting it to her mouth and gingerly biting off a piece. It was amazing. It was just like eating cardboard. In fact, cardboard probably would have had more nutrients and tasted a whole lot better to boot. Sally took another hesitant bite, grimaced, and reached for the folded newspaper at her side to take her mind off the taste. She flicked through a couple of sections, chewing absently, then settled down to read. After an indeterminate period, a flustered waitress came by and took her coffee cup away, silently replacing it with another. Sally didn't notice. She was engrossed in her paper, and Mitchell was dead. Sally tried reading the cartoons next, then flicked back a couple of pages to check out tonight's TV listings, which was stupid because she was 100 miles from home. A memory twanged in her head. Mitchell had the best TV ever, a 32-inch plasma screen. He'd spent nearly 3 months dragging her around electronics shops while he compared prices and models before settling on the first one he'd originally seen, satisfied that the extra money was worth it. But now he was dead and couldn't watch TV. She turned the page and read an article about a local guy who had just shot his wife because, he said, she had been vacuuming in a really irritating way. Sally gave a ghost of a smile. That one would have made Mitchell laugh. Only he couldn't laugh because he was dead. Sally put down her paper with a sigh. She knew that she was already well into stage 1 of grieving for him. Her initial shock had given way to numbness and a certain amount of disbelief. She knew this because she'd studied the grieving process for her final exams before she graduated, all those years ago, and she knew the symptoms off by heart. She'd even drawn a colorful chart to help her remember them in the right order. Right now, though, she didn't give a flying fuck about what the textbook said. Nobody in the world had ever felt that bad before. Shaking herself, Sally picked up the paper and was about to toss it back onto the rack next to her, when a small heading on the back page caught her eye. She began reading, then unfolded the paper and laid it flat on the coffee-stained table. It was a column written by a girl at the nearby high school, a humorous article about how the residents of Springwood weren't dreaming lately. Sally's brow creased into a frown as she reread the article, then put it down and sat back in her chair, gazing thoughtfully at the paper. It had to be a coincidence, but she wanted to be sure. She stared into space for a moment, then slipped her miniature cell phone out of her pocket and dialed a familiar number. It rang for 30 seconds or so before Sally gave up. She clicked her phone closed and put it down on the table beside the newspaper, frowning at it. No reception, huh? Sally glanced across to the next booth to see a skinny guy dressed in a tatty gray business suit, nodding at her sympathetically. He was balding, around 40, and had an air of quiet resignation about him. Her psychiatrist's mind instantly clicked into action as she evaluated the man, either eternally single or recently divorced, owned at least one goldfish, and went home every day to an immaculate, empty apartment. The kind of person who quietly and uncomplainingly greased the wheels of society and would die alone, aged 88, in a government retirement home, wishing desperately that he had had more sex. Sally shrugged in a non-committal way. And the service sucks. It's been one of those days. Tell me about it. Suit guy glanced anxiously over his shoulder, then leaned in closer toward her. I've been waiting here 45 minutes, and they still haven't brought me my food. Really? Sally glanced back at the service counter. They brought me mine pretty quick. Suit guy nodded glumly. Just my luck, I guess. What is it about me? Do I have some kind of sign over my head reading, "Ignore me"? Sally shrugged. I get that in a lot of restaurants. I just stand there at the bar while everyone else around me gets served. It sucks. The man's face darkened. You shouldn't put up with it. He turned to face the restaurant. Waitress! The pink-suited waitress paused, then continued serving the overweight family of 5 in the corner booth, several tables away from them. The pudgy 3-year-old sitting with his parents giggled and hurled his cutlery to the floor, earning himself a smack around the ear from his stern-looking father. He began bawling loudly. See? Look at that. She is ignoring me. Suit guy's voice rose. He turned back to the waitress. Hey! How about I get some fucking service over here? This time the waitress glanced over at him, then turned back and continued writing down her order. The fat boy's crying increased several decibels in volume. Sally saw the man's hand tighten on his menu. Hey, don't sweat it, she said soothingly. I'll grab her when she comes over. You shouldn't have to. Sally saw that the man's face was pale with sudden rage. His eyes seemed to cloud over like a jet of black ink poured into a tank of clear water. Before she could stop him, he rose to his feet. Hey, you! He yelled. A hush fell over the restaurant. Diners swiveled in their seats and gawped at the man, who stood clutching his menu like a shield, staring at the waitress. Slowly, she turned around to face him. Yeah, bitch, I'm talking to you, said the man. What are you, fucking deaf? I've been sitting here for a whole hour, and did you even once so much as glance in my direction? No, you've just been ignoring me. Would you like to order? Said the waitress. No, I think I'd like to sit here for another 40 fucking minutes while you serve everyone else in the restaurant, including that guy who came in half an hour after me. Suit guy stabbed a finger at a heavyset trucker sitting in the booth next to him, who glazed up blarily through a mouthful of pie. Then I'd like you to bring me another cup of coffee to replace this one, which was cold to fucking start with. Perhaps this time without lipstick on the cup. Then maybe you could wipe down my table so I don't have to worry about putting my elbow in ketchup and maybe empty my ashtray. Or is that too much to ask of you? There was a short, hot silence. Sally stared at the man, both eyebrows raised, mentally reevaluating him. She was impressed and also kind of scared. Trucker guy broke the silence. Hey, buddy, what's your problem? Bad move. Suit Guy turned slowly around to face him, moving as though he were being pulled by strings. You think I've got a problem? Hey! He turned back to face the rest of the diner. He thinks I've got a problem! With the suddenness that made Sally jump, he slammed both his hands on the post, dividing the booths, and shoved his face right up into the trucker guy's. I'll tell you what my problem is. It's people like you, waltzing your way through life, getting served, when people like me sit here and wait patiently while you get all the coffee, all the pancakes, all the cream pies. He lashed out with his hand and sent Trucker Guy's dessert clattering to the floor. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, which rose steadily until he was almost shouting. Well, I'll tell you something, buddy. I'm all out of patience. So how's about you give me a break and get out of here so other people can get some goddamn food? More silence. In the corner, the overweight boy stopped bawling and watched Suit Guy with sudden interest. Outside in the parking lot, a horn blared. Trucker Guy looked at the guy in the suit. He didn't take this kind of crap from anyone, let alone some two-bit white-collar anorexic who looked like he'd struggled to lift a case of cherry coke. Himself, he could easily bench press the weight of a full-grown man and still have strength left to kick his ass when he was done. So he did the only thing that came naturally. He started to laugh. Next thing he knew, his head hit the side of the booth as Suit Guy grabbed a handful of his hair and slammed his face into the wooden post. Shock made him freeze for just long enough for Suit Guy to get in one good slam. Then anger kicked in and he wrenched himself free, grabbing the spluttering man by the scruff of his neck. With a heave, he sent him sprawling forward onto the floor, then lurched to his feet and towered over the floored accountant, who took the opportunity to kick him nastily in the shins. Sally decided wisely to duck back down in her booth as the fight raged in the diner aisle, only half aware that the cell phone in her hand was ringing. As the diner's security guard started jogging across the restaurant to separate the scrapping pair, she looked down at her phone as it rang for the 8th and final time. Shaking her head, she flipped it open. There was a click, then a voice. Dr. Spencer? Speaking. Sally cupped a hand to the phone as a loud crash signaled the end of a corner display of soup cups. Sorry, it's a little loud in here. Go on. Sheriff Williams here. We need you to come back down to the station, I'm afraid. Just more paperwork for the inquest into your partner. And there's a few things we forgot to get you to sign. Mitchell? He wasn't my... Oh, I see. Yes, of course. No problem at all, sir. Sally covered the phone with a wince as the security guard flew past her, unceremoniously ejected from the melee. Families scrambling to get out of the way as cups of coffee and plates of food went flying. What time's good for you? ASAP, ma'am, if you don't mind. Sure, fine. I'll make my way over there now. Oh, and Sheriff? Yes? Send a squad car across to the diner at the corner of Main Street and Pier. She glanced up as there was a loud clatter. And maybe a paramedic van. There's a disturbance, right? You're very perceptive, Sheriff. Not really. It's been that kind of week. Sally closed the phone and dropped it into her bag, then stood up and edged cautiously past the tussling men on the floor, heading for the open door. Something about this town just seemed to drive people crazy. And if her current theory was correct, the sheriff would want to know all about her findings. Shivering, she wrapped her jacket around herself and hurried out into the fading daylight. Back at the station, Sheriff Williams put down the phone and sighed. He was not having a good day. It started with that wacko kid up at Weston going postal on his bunkmates. Continued with a bunch of lunatics from the town, beating the shit out of each other all day. And now it was enlivened by this woman's reports of spontaneous combustion and a talking corpse, not to mention the whole shitload of paperwork that the day's events had generated. What was wrong with this place? The sheriff pinched the bridge of his nose as a wave of horrendous images passed through his mind. He reached into his pocket, popped a little blue pill into his mouth, and swallowed it. Okay, he knew what was wrong with this place, but why did it always have to happen on his day off? The sheriff glanced around his office, taking in the general confusion and chaos, and sighed. He should have been at home, sprawled happily on the couch with a cold beer in one hand and a TV guide in the other, while the delicious scents of a Sunday roast wafted through from the kitchen. Then, maybe later on in the evening, he'd take his long-suffering wife to the movies, followed by a drink at the Dog and Ranger and a solid 8 hours of sleep, to fortify him against the horrors the coming week would undoubtedly bring. Instead, he was here, working his ass off while people he didn't even know shouted at him. In the 10 years since he'd first started working in the town, Sheriff Williams had seen so much shit go down that he was still having a hard time understanding or even believing it. Over the last few years in particular, he'd seen shit that would turn an LA beat cop white. But all this shit was real, and, at the end of the day, it was his responsibility to clean up. The buck stopped with him, and it was his job to make sure his town was safe. The trouble was, in this town, it was one hell of a job. Some days that applied quite literally. The sheriff closed the blind and stood quietly in the darkened office, listening to the hubbub of voices from next door. This one was a new one to him. Over the last 2 weeks, his officers had made over 60 arrests, almost unheard of in a small town like this. The suspects weren't from any particular location and ranged from a 14-year-old kid who stabbed his teacher through the eye with a compass to an 80-year-old grandmother who'd apparently poisoned her husband of 50 years by putting weed killer in his soup. No, people were at one another's throats, and most of them had no greater mitigating circumstances than they just lost it. He took a sip of his coffee, shuddered at the taste and crossed to the other side of the room. He pulled up the blind, then tossed the mug out of the window with great relish. There was a crash of breaking crockery and the traditional shriek of a cat. He closed the sash window. It was a small gesture of frustration, but it made him feel so much better. He should have retired years ago. He could feel it in every single aching bone in his body. He felt literally worn out, as though, if he stood too close to a bright light, people would be able to see right through him, like tissue paper. But he still had a job to do, an important job at that. If he left, he would abdicate all control over whatever he was going down, and the thought terrified him more than anything else in the world. So he stayed. On some nights, though, he wished his duties would just go take a flying leap. Almost unconsciously, he pulled the cover off the dusty TV standing in the corner and switched it on. A picture of a house came up, a live feed from one of the many street cameras creeping their way into America's towns and cities. The house was painted white, with a wooden front porch and a grassy yard out the front. It was identical to the hundreds of other middle-class homes lining the streets of Springwood. But to the sheriff, the very sight of it made a sick chill run up his spine. The sheriff picked up a remote control unit from the desk and pushed one of the buttons. The house vanished, replaced by a cluttered living room stacked high with cardboard boxes. Nobody was around, but it was clear from the state of the room that some kind of packing operation was underway. Another click of the remote, and a hallway was revealed, with a huge mass of clothing draped over the wooden stair rail. A large German shepherd sat at the foot of the stairs, staring fixedly upwards. Yet another click, and a white-tiled bathroom filled the frame. The image was slightly fogged with steam, but an old woman was just visible, lying naked in the tub. There was no sound, but she was clearly singing to herself as she washed her hair, blissfully unaware that she was being watched by a total stranger on a TV set, only 10 blocks away. One more click, a darkened kitchen, a cellar, then a bedroom. Here the sheriff paused, walking closer to the set and peering intently at the image. It was a girl's room, evidenced by the abundance of shoes and underwear that covered every available surface. The room was empty, except for, "Resting up in front of the TV, sir?" The sheriff jumped and span around, clicking off the set as he did so. He glared at the officer lurking in the doorway, a new recruit named Snood, though everyone called him Officer Snoop, on account of his uncanny ability to be in the right place at the wrong time. Sheriff Williams regained his composure almost as quickly as he'd lost it. "Is there anything I can help you with, Snood?" "We could use a hand next door, sir," said Snood, utterly unfazed. He lifted the big curtain blind that screened the office main window and jerked his head toward it. Outside, the waiting room was filled with people, all clamoring for attention. All his staff were out on urgent calls, leaving just 2 officers to man the besieged office. Officer Dewey was fending off a barrage of questions by one obviously very angry woman, while in the corner, a 200-pound trucker, who the sheriff presumed was her husband, was trying to remove Officer Lopez's head with just one hand, the other being chained to the leg of a heavy steel desk. As Sheriff Williams watched, the leg gave way and the whole desk pitched sideways. Heaped papers and potted plants crashed to the floor as the other hand, now freed, grabbed Officer Lopez's neck and started to choke the life out of him. Sighing, Sheriff Williams nodded to Officer Snood to drop the blind. Pulling open his desk drawer, he picked up his gun and went to restore the peace. Snood's jaw fell open. Sir?" he said. Williams ignored him. Kicking open the door, he stared into the chaotic room, then pointed his pistol at the ceiling. The gunshot was deafening. All noise was instantly replaced by a ringing silence. "Everybody be quiet," he yelled. After a good 5 seconds had passed, someone said, "Sir?" Sheriff Williams glanced to his left to see Officer Dewey cowering behind a desk. "What is it, Dewey?" he snapped. The officer pointed mutely to the gun that the sheriff still held aloft. Don't think we're supposed to discharge our firearms in public, sir," he mumbled, then added, "with all due respect." Williams lowered the gun and frowned, tucking it away in his waistband of his pants. "Sorry," he said. "I just lost—" His frown deepened. "Sir, are you all right?" Snood peered timidly through from the sheriff's office. Williams turned back to address the room. "Everyone shut up and just sit down," he shouted, blustering to cover his confusion. All around the room, frightened people scuttled for the chairs. Still frowning, the sheriff went back into his office, laid his gun on the desk, and stared at it hard. Then he reached into his top breast pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper. It was crumpled and torn, stained with what looked like barbecue sauce. He unfolded it and gave a deep sigh that came from the very core of his being. Then he picked up the phone, glanced at the paper, and started dialing the number that he'd hoped he would never have to call again. Okay, this has been chapters 3 and 4 of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream. I am really digging this book. I'm glad that this is the last one in the Black Flame, A Nightmare on Elm Street series, and I'm glad that it's entertaining. I'm really enjoying the story. I mean, this town is going crazy. All sleep and no dreams make Springwood a scary place to live. Apparently everybody's just losing their minds for a second there. What do you guys think of that plot? Let me know in the comments section. I find it kind of intriguing that the lack of dreams is causing some of Freddy's evil to seep out into this town. At least that's what I think's going on. We'll find out as we read forward. I've never read this book until now. So I'm experiencing this book at the same time you guys are. Most of the books I narrate, I'm experiencing for the first time, as you guys are. Alright guys, like I said in the beginning, be sure to check out the channel in the description below for Deborah Voorhees' film company. She's making this awesome movie that's coming out called 13 Fanboy. The trailer I showed at the beginning. I'm really excited to see that movie. I think any slasher fan is going to appreciate it. The cast is just amazing. Alright guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!